The 1970s gave us some real muscle car legends, but also some of the worst engines ever built. These are the 15 worst muscle car engines from the 1970s that ruined the fun, speed, and power people expected. Number 15, 1975 Pontiac 301 V8. The 1975 Pontiac 301 V8, a true letdown in a time when drivers craved strength and speed. On paper, it seemed like a decent idea. It had a 301 cubic inch engine. But under the hood, things didn't roar, they wheezed. The engine had only a 2-barrel carburetor and made just 135 horsepower. For a muscle car, that was barely a whisper compared to the thunder others brought. This engine was made with a shorter deck and thin walls to make it lighter. But lighter didn't mean better. It used a special crankshaft with only 2 counterweights instead of the usual 5, which made it weaker under pressure. Even the connecting rod journals were lightened, and while that saved a little weight, it also made the engine more fragile. It may have weighed less than Chevrolet's small block 5E8, but it didn't come close in terms of strength or performance. That light design turned out to be more of a burden than a benefit. Additionally, the cylinder heads had Siamese intake ports, which meant 2 intake runners shared the same space. That design caused poor airflow, so the engine couldn't breathe properly. The intake manifold had to be redesigned too, but that didn't solve the problem. Instead of helping the engine perform better, it only made things more complicated and less efficient. And even with all that effort, the power stayed low, never rising above 170 horsepower in any version. For a car that was supposed to be exciting, this engine made sure it wasn't. Worse still, the Pontiac 301 V8 couldn't handle high-performance add-ons. The block wasn't strong enough for high pressure or heavy upgrades, so you couldn't make it faster even if you wanted to. Turbo versions tried to squeeze out more power later on, but they needed extra care, special fuel, and still didn't blow anyone away. In the end, this engine became known not for speed, but for holding back the muscle. It may have been the last true Pontiac V8, but it sure didn't go out with a bang. Number 14, 1978 Ford 302 V8 Windsor. In 1978, the Ford 302 cubic inch V8, also called the Windsor, became one of the most disappointing engines of the decade. At a time when drivers wanted strength under the hood, this small block gave them soft growls instead of big roars. It looked like it belonged in a muscle car, but once you pressed the pedal, the power just wasn't there. By this year, the engine had been hit hard by new rules meant to reduce pollution and save fuel. The once proud V8 had been reduced to using a 2-barrel carburetor and made only about 140 horsepower. That was far too little for a muscle car that needed to move fast and feel alive. And while other engines still gave a thrill, this one felt more like it belonged in a quiet sedan than a street beast. Power was slipping and excitement faded with every mile. The inside of the engine wasn't much better. Ford had lowered the compression ratio to keep up with fuel economy and emissions laws. This meant the engine didn't push as hard, which made it weaker during acceleration. And the parts used in the Windsor were often leftovers from older designs, making it feel dated and tired, even though it was still being sold as something fresh. The technology stayed behind while other engines tried to move forward. In addition, cooling systems were also basic, and the exhaust setup didn't help it breathe well under pressure. Even though the Windsor was once known for its durability, the 1978 version had none of the thrill it was supposed to deliver. The engine's response was slow, its performance dull, and there was no joy in revving it up. It was like putting running shoes on someone who only wanted to walk. Number 13, 1976 Chevrolet 300 5V8. In 1976, Chevrolet introduced a new engine called the 305 cubic inch V8. It was meant to be a smaller, smarter version of the famous 350 VR8. With rising fuel prices and strict new rules for gas mileage and pollution, this engine was made to save money and use less fuel. But for fans of muscle cars, it felt more like a quiet whisper than a bold roar. The 305th was weak right from the start. Now let's talk power. This engine had a smaller cylinder bore of 3.736 inches and shared the same stroke as its bigger brother. It even came with a lighter crankshaft. On paper, that all sounded clever. But when the rubber met the road, it didn't deliver the speed or thrill drivers wanted from a muscle machine. Instead of power and punch, the 305 gave out a soft, lazy hum. Even with its small block design, it didn't bring the muscle that the 70s muscle cars were known for. One big problem was the camshaft. Many of these engines had camshaft failures early in their life. Poor quality control made the engine unreliable, and some drivers were left with engines that stopped working far too soon. Even when the engine stayed alive, it didn't give much to cheer about. With only a 2-barrel carburetor and weak compression, it barely made enough horsepower to excite anyone. In many cases, it struggled to go past 140 horses. That's not much muscle in a car built to race. Some versions of the engine were a little better later on, like the high-output models. But those came much later and didn't change the fact that the 1976 version was a big disappointment. It didn't belong in a Camaro or Firebird, not when drivers expected real muscle and got a sleepy engine instead. The power felt flat, the sound was dull, and the performance was forgettable. Even though the engine found new life in racing much later, back in the 70s, it gave muscle cars a bad name. Instead of charging down the street, it felt like they were crawling. Number 12, 1977 Dodge 318 V8. This V8 came from Chrysler's lightweight A series, built to be smaller and more efficient. But when it came to muscle car power, it didn't stand a chance against the real giants of the road. It had the shape of a V8 and the size that sounded promising, yet the performance was weak and left fans disappointed. However, muscle cars were meant to be loud and quick, but the 318 had a quiet, gentle growl. This engine used a 2-barrel carburetor that kept horsepower low, sometimes dipping under 150. While other engines pushed hard and roared down highways, this one struggled to make a strong impression. Acceleration was slow, and the engine didn't have the kick to match the sharp design of the cars it lived in. Under the hood, the design was simple, but not in a good way for power lovers. The cast iron block made it strong, but the small valves, mild camshaft, and tight airflow meant the engine could not breathe well at higher speeds. That made it feel sleepy when it should have been lively. Even with all its durability, the engine felt better suited for quiet cruising than muscle car madness. As rules for cleaner air and better gas mileage got tougher in the 1970s, this engine kept getting weaker. Compression was lowered, which took away even more strength. Instead of fixing the power problems, changes made the engine slower and softer, especially when stacked up against other muscle machines of the time. What used to be a reliable truck engine didn't belong on the muscle car stage. Although the engine could be rebuilt or upgraded, that wasn't the case for most buyers in 1977. Straight from the factory, the 318 V8 simply didn't deliver the power drivers expected. What do you think? Was it the worst of the bunch? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Number 11, 1973 AMC 304 V8. In 1973, the AMC 304 cubic-inch V8 engine sat proudly under the hood of many muscle-style cars. Built by American Motors Corporation, this engine started off strong. At first, it made over 200 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque. That sounded exciting, but by the middle of the 1970s, things began to fall apart. What was once a strong motor slowly turned into one of the weakest V8 engines of the decade. The trouble came when new rules about pollution forced changes to many engines, including this one. To meet these clean air laws, the AMC 304 had to be tamed. Its power dropped fast. The horsepower fell to around 125, and torque dropped to 220 pound-feet. For a muscle car engine, that made it feel sleepy. It no longer had the push or punch needed to make these cars exciting to drive. Well, the design was simple, with a cast iron block and heads, overhead valves, and hydraulic lifters. While that helped make the engine reliable, it also made it boring. It couldn't breathe very well, and with small carburetors and weaker compression, it lost much of the power that once made it special. The sound and strength were gone, replaced by a quiet hum that didn't match the wild look of the cars it powered. Worse still, the engine was heavy. It added extra pounds to the front of the car without giving back the speed and thrill that drivers expected. Handling became tougher, and fuel economy didn't improve much either. So drivers were stuck with an engine that was slow, heavy, and no longer fun. It was a poor trade in the name of fuel savings and cleaner air. Even the straight-six engine, once thought to be weaker, began to catch up by the end of the decade. Some versions of the straight six made nearly the same power as the V8, but with less weight and better balance. That made the 304 look even worse by comparison. Once a proud power plant, it had become a burden. Number 10. 1974 Chevrolet 400 small block. The Chevrolet 400 cubic inch small block was supposed to be a big deal. It was the largest small block Chevy had ever made, and that made people excited. But once this engine hit the roads, it didn't live up to the hype. On paper, it looked strong, but in real life, it was full of problems that made it one of the weakest muscle car engines of the 1970s. Not to mention, this engine used a special design where the cylinders sat very close together. Because of that, it needed extra steam holes to keep from getting too hot. But even with those, overheating became a common issue. The cooling system struggled to keep everything calm, especially under heavy loads or on hot days. That made drivers nervous and cars unreliable. Moving on, the engine had its own short connecting rods and big journals, which made it different from other small block Chevys. Sadly, these changes didn't bring better performance. Instead, they made the engine harder to repair and even harder to build into something faster. With only a 2-barrel carburetor at first, it could barely manage 150 horsepower. Later models with a 4-barrel carburetor made only about 180 horsepower, far too little for a muscle car in a decade full of power cuts. Even worse, the build quality started to suffer. The blocks often had rust and pitting. Some mechanics found them in such bad shape that they looked like they had been pulled from the bottom of a lake. Fixing them cost way too much, and skipping proper repairs led to broken parts and blown motors. The cylinder walls wore out fast, and the crankshaft sometimes needed grinding after just a few years of use. What made it worse was how heavy the engine was for its size. While it could make a lot of torque, it didn't deliver enough speed to make that extra weight worth it. Instead of helping cars fly down the road, it slowed them down. The power was there at low speeds, but muscle cars needed more than just grunt. They needed real punch. Number 9. 1972 Ford 351 MV8. Ford rolled out the 351 cubic inch M-Series V8 engine in 1972. People were curious because this engine was part of the big 335 family, but right from the start, it had trouble living up to expectations. It looked strong, but when it came to real muscle car power, the 351M quickly earned a spot on the list of disappointing engines from the 70s. At first glance, the engine seemed impressive with its tall deck design and wide stance. But under all that bulk was an engine that just didn't deliver. Its power was weak, with horsepower ratings barely keeping up with smaller engines. It made only around 170 horsepower, hardly enough for a muscle car. The engine's big size made it heavier too, slowing down cars instead of speeding them up. Then came the design problems. The engine block was heavy and wide, which made it hard to fit into smaller cars and tricky to work on. Mechanics didn't enjoy fixing it, and car lovers found it hard to upgrade. Its parts didn't match with other engines, so rebuilding or improving it took extra time and money. That meant fewer people wanted to use it, even for fun projects. Furthermore, the 351M also used low-compression heads, which were meant to make the engine run on regular gas. But this design hurt performance badly. The engine couldn't breathe well, which meant it didn't rev high or respond fast. Another issue was that this engine shared pieces with the 400 cubic inch V8, but without any of the extra power. It had a long stroke, but a small carburetor, so it struggled to move air and fuel the way a real performance engine should. It sounded tough, but couldn't back it up with speed. By the time it was in cars like the Ford Torino or Mercury Cougar, the engine was already falling behind. Number 8. 1971 Oldsmobile 260 V8. With a tiny size of only 260 cubic inches, this engine was the smallest of the Oldsmobile V8s and sadly one of the weakest too. One big problem was the tiny 2-barrel carburetor it came with, called the Rochester Dual Jet. This little carburetor wasn't built for speed or fun. It gave the engine just 110 horsepower, which wasn't enough to make muscle cars feel fast or powerful. When you pressed the gas, the car didn't jump, it yawned. Compared to bigger Olds engines like the 350 or 403, the 260 felt like it was always playing catch-up. The design itself didn't help things either. Even though the engine looked like its bigger cousins, It had much smaller intake ports, so air and fuel didn't flow well. People tried to swap in bigger intake manifolds, but they didn't match right. This caused the fuel to swirl and mix badly, which hurt power even more. And making upgrades to this engine was tricky because most parts didn't fit without extra work or custom pieces. Then came the problem with the heads. Swapping in heads from a bigger engine sounded like a good idea, but the valves were so big they hit the cylinder walls. To fix it, people had to cut into the engine block, which wasn't easy or cheap. Plus, those bigger heads made the compression ratio drop even lower. That made the engine even lazier, especially when paired with mild rear-end gears meant for fuel savings. The 260 was made for good gas mileage, not for burning rubber. Most came with the weak turbo-hydromatic 200 transmission, which couldn't handle much power anyway. So even if someone tried to build it up, the rest of the drivetrain would give up first. When it came to muscle, the 1971 Oldsmobile 260 V8 simply didn't have the fire. It was small, slow, and not worth the time or money to fix. For anyone dreaming of roaring down the road, this engine only brought disappointment. Number 7. Chrysler Slant 619-8CI.
There's your big motor mount.
Back in 1970, Chrysler brought out a new engine called the Slant 6 with 198 cubic inches. It sounded like it would be stronger than the earlier 170 version. At first, it kind of was. It made 125 horsepower and 180 pound-feet of torque, which wasn't too bad for a small engine. People hoped it would give cars like the Dodge Challenger and Plymouth Barracuda a little extra kick, but that little boost didn't last long. Just a few years later, everything started to change. New laws came in to help the air stay cleaner, and that meant car makers had to change their engines. By the time 1973 and 1974 rolled around, the 198 engine had lost its edge. It only made 95 horsepower and around 150 pound-feet of torque. That was actually weaker than the old 170 version from before. What made it worse was where this engine showed up. It was put inside cars that looked sporty and fast. On the outside, the cars looked like muscle machines. But under the hood, the Slant 6 made them slow and sluggish. Pressing the gas felt more like waiting in line than taking off. Even the bigger version, the 225 cubic inch to Slant 6, wasn't much better after 1975. New rules meant it had to use a catalytic converter, which took away even more power. So even the engines that replaced the 198 didn't bring much excitement. Number 6. 1975 Buick 350 VI8. In the middle of the 1970s, the Buick 350 cubic inch V8 engine was found inside many of their muscle cars. Apparently, it sounded like a strong choice. After all, it shared the same size number as other engines from Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile. But this one didn't quite live up to the muscle car dream. The engine had a long piston stroke and a design that looked good on paper. But on the road, things felt different. This Buick engine had something called a deep skirt block, which made it strong and stiff. It also used heavy iron with extra nickel inside, meant to add toughness. Even the tall and narrow cylinder heads were supposed to help airflow better. But all those smart-sounding features couldn't make up for how this engine truly felt when you pressed the gas. It was heavy, slow to respond, and didn't bring much excitement to the ride. When the engine first came out, it offered some higher horsepower with special versions. One 4-barrel model could make up to 315 horsepower. But by 1975, those strong versions were long gone. The power dropped, and the newer models struggled to get much over 200 horsepower. This was the time when fuel rules and emissions laws were getting stricter, and the Buick 350 lost most of its energy trying to keep up. The real trouble came from how the engine reacted to these changes. As other car makers found ways to keep power while cutting pollution, the Buick 350 fell behind. The engine started to feel tired, especially when used in big, heavy cars that needed more strength to move quickly. Instead of roaring, this engine groaned under pressure. So even though it looked like a good engine with a famous size, the 1975 Buick 350 V8 couldn't keep up with what muscle cars were meant to be. Number 5. 1976 Cadillac 500 V8. Back in the 1970s, Cadillac made a huge engine called the 500 cubic inch V8. It was the biggest V8 engine ever used in an American car. This engine made 400 horsepower and a massive 550 pound-feet of torque. It was only found in big luxury cars and was designed to move heavy cars with smooth and quiet strength. But by the time 1976 rolled around, this once mighty engine had lost its magic. As the years went by, strict emissions rules came along, and the Cadillac 500 engine began to suffer. To meet the new rules, the compression ratio was lowered, and more parts were added to clean the exhaust. These changes hurt the engine's power. By 1976, the engine only made 190 horsepower, and torque had dropped down to just 360 pound-feet. That was a big drop from its early days and made the engine feel weak and tired in a car that still weighed over 2.5 tons. Not only this, but the engine's design was also a problem. While it was large and strong, it was heavy and not very efficient. It took up a lot of space and didn't use fuel wisely. The engine had been built more for smooth driving than speed, which made it a poor fit for muscle car fans who wanted quick takeoffs and roaring power. The 500 V8 tried to look bold, but deep inside it had become slow and sluggish. By 1976, it was clear that the Cadillac 500 V8 had fallen behind. Its size didn't matter anymore because its strength had faded. It was a big engine with a small voice. Number 4, 1979 Ford 255 V8. In 1979, Ford added a new V8 engine to its Mustang lineup, the 255 cubic inch V8. This engine, deep down, it didn't have much muscle at all. It was made to save fuel, not to win races or turn heads. With only 118 horsepower and 193 pound-feet of torque, it struggled to move even the lightest cars with any excitement. Beyond this, the design of this engine was a big part of the problem. It looked like Ford's famous 302 cubic inch small block V8, but this one was smaller on the inside. The bore was reduced, which meant the engine couldn't breathe as well. The smaller size made the engine weaker, and it didn't respond well when drivers pushed the gas pedal. It had a low compression ratio of 8.8 to 1, which made it feel lazy and slow. Then came the strange intake system. Most small block Fords had rectangle-shaped intake ports and used solid gaskets. But the 255 had oval-shaped ports and a valley tray that combined the gaskets with the intake in one piece. This setup didn't help airflow, and poor airflow meant poor power. Even worse, the heads had smaller valves and tiny combustion chambers, which made it even harder for the engine to breathe and perform well. It didn't stop there. The crankshaft inside was made of hollow-core nodular iron. That might sound fancy, but it was really just a way to make it lighter. Some thought it was too weak for real performance. Many car fans didn't trust it and stayed far away from trying to build anything fast with it. There weren't many parts made for it either, making upgrades nearly impossible. Number 3, 1975 Dodge 360 V8. Back in 1975, Dodge had a V8 engine called the 360 cubic inch. This engine came from the LA family, which meant it was supposed to be light and quick. It had a bore of 4 inches and a stroke of 3.58 inches, which made it sound strong on paper. But in real life, things were not so exciting under the hood. At one time, this engine had some power. A few years earlier, it used a 4-barrel carburetor and made 245 horsepower. That sounded pretty good. But as new rules came in to control pollution, this engine got weaker and weaker. By 1975, the power had dropped a lot. The same engine now made only about 185 horsepower. It felt like the muscle had been drained out of this once promising V8. That wasn't the only issue. The 360 used big heads for airflow, but the intake valves were smaller than before, only about 1.88 inches wide. This meant the air and fuel didn't move as fast, and the engine couldn't breathe the way a real muscle engine should. When an engine can't breathe well, it can't make strong power either. It struggled when drivers wanted it to roar. The exhaust didn't help either. In the early days, some versions of this engine came with dual exhausts, which helped a little. But by the mid-70s, extra equipment was added to clean up the exhaust gases. That made everything heavier and more restricted. It became harder for the engine to let out hot air fast, so it lost even more power along the way. Later versions of this engine had something called lean burn. That was a system meant to save gas, but it caused the engine to act funny. It didn't always run smoothly, and fixing it was hard. Car owners didn't like how the engine stuttered, hesitated, or felt lazy when they pressed the pedal. Even though this engine was used in trucks and even in some special editions like the red pickup, most regular cars that got it didn't feel fast or exciting. It was too quiet, too slow, and too choked by all the new changes made for fuel and emissions. Drivers were left with an engine that looked tough on the outside, but couldn't deliver muscle where it mattered. Number 2, 1971 Chrysler 400 V8. In 1971, it was supposed to replace the famous 383 engine, and at first it seemed like a bold step forward. With a wide bore size of 4.342 inches, the largest of any Chrysler V8 back then, it looked ready for action. But this engine didn't live up to the big expectations that muscle car fans had for it. This 400 V8 had a strong start, coming in 3 versions. There was a 2-barrel carburetor model that made 170 horsepower, a 4-barrel model that gave 205 horsepower, and a high-performance version with a dual exhaust that cranked out 260 horsepower. On paper, those numbers looked okay, especially with all versions using an 8.2-to-1 compression ratio. But real-world results told a different story. The power just didn't feel strong, especially compared to older Chrysler engines or other muscle car monsters of the era. Things went downhill quickly. As the years rolled on, more emissions rules forced Chrysler to add parts that choked the engine's breath. By the time 1978 rolled around, the 400 V8 only made 190 horsepower. That kind of number was closer to what a smaller 6-cylinder could do, not what you'd expect from a big V8. The extra weight and tight airflow from all the new pollution equipment made the engine feel slow, soft, and tired. Even the design choices were odd. The engine used cast iron crankshafts instead of stronger forged ones. That meant the inside parts were heavier and not as tough. The cylinder heads, which should have helped with airflow, didn't do much to boost excitement. And though some versions shared parts with the earlier 383 engine, the pistons were different, making repairs and upgrades harder for gearheads who like to tinker. Another weak spot came from how the engine was used. The 400 wasn't just for muscle cars. It was stuffed into trucks, vans, and even motorhomes. That gave it a reputation as more of a workhorse than a racehorse. While other big V8s roared with glory on the drag strip, this one slowly rolled down highways, pulling campers and carrying furniture. That wasn't the kind of image a muscle engine wanted to have. There was a small spark of hope for the 400 later on. Some builders discovered that the engine's strong bottom end and wide bore made it a good platform for high-performance builds. With the right mix of parts and tuning, it could be turned into a real powerhouse. But that wasn't the factory version. Most people never saw that side of the 400. What they got from the dealer lot was an engine that sounded big but felt sleepy. Number 1, 1979 AMC 232 Inline 6. The year was 1979, and the American Motors Corporation still held on to its faithful 232 cubic inch inline 6 engine. This motor had been around since 1964, and by now it was showing its age. Even though AMC had made several changes over the years, the engine had become more of a slow and steady workhorse than the heart of any serious muscle car. For a time when muscle machines were all about roar, rumble, and raw power, the 232 just didn't have the muscle to keep up. One of the biggest problems with this engine was that it never made much power. Most versions from the late 70s offered around 100 horsepower, not exactly the stuff of legends. That meant muscle cars using this engine couldn't deliver the kind of speed or excitement that fans expected. At a time when the competition was still fighting to stay thrilling despite tighter rules, the AMC 232 simply felt weak. It was the kind of engine you'd expect in a basic family sedan, not a car with stripes and a spoiler. The design also made it hard to feel like a real performance engine. Though it was built with overhead valves and had some modern touches, the motor just didn't breathe very well. The long inline layout took up space under the hood and didn't respond well to go-fast parts. With narrow ports and a tame camshaft, there was no wild sound or jump-off-the-line excitement. Even the 2-barrel carburetor setup didn't help much. It sipped gas more than it made power. Fuel efficiency did get better in the late 70s, but that came with another downside: less fun. To meet new rules and squeeze out more miles per gallon, AMC reshaped the air passages in the carburetor. That made engines like the one in the AMC Gremlin get up to 30 miles per gallon, but also made the engine feel more like a lawnmower than a muscle car engine. Drivers could go far, but they couldn't go fast. Even the engine size became a problem. The 232 was too long to fit in some cars with air conditioning unless a special short water pump was used. That meant packaging issues and tricky maintenance. AMC had to make changes just to fit the thing in their smaller models. If something went wrong, repairs could be tough in tight spaces. By 1979, this engine had shared parts with the 258 cubic inch motor and had gone through multiple updates. But none of those changes gave it the power it needed to stand tall in the muscle car world. It just kept getting quieter, slower, and more forgotten. Even the switch to a V8 bolt pattern didn't turn it into anything more than a soft six-cylinder engine. In the end, in the world of muscle cars, fans wanted loud noise, tire smoke, and neck-snapping power. The AMC 232 Inline 6 was reliable and smooth, but too calm for the crowd. Which of these engines do you think was the absolute worst? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more muscle car stories.